The hallway light overhead flickers once and doesn't come back on. Somewhere below him, an elevator groans awake. He stands very still and listens to the cables pull taut. The doors part on the 12th floor, and the thing waiting inside is already looking at him. It doesn't have a face so much as the suggestion of one. Pale, stretched too long, glistening. Long arms unfold from somewhere they shouldn't be able to reach from, and under the hum of the motor, 1,000 small voices, all together, all at once, whisper the same word. Dad. 2 weeks before that, all Nick Walsh wanted was to be alone for a while. When the door clicked shut behind his wife and daughter, something in his chest loosened for the first time in months. Sarah was taking their girl up to Kapuskasing to stay with her mum for a couple of weeks, a small town far enough north that cell service dropped out twice on the drive, every single time they'd made it. Nick used to make fun of that town. Now he was grateful for it. For the first time in what felt like forever, the apartment was his. Just his. Outside, the city was locked into the kind of July heat that turns asphalt soft and makes the whole block smell like hot tar and cut grass. The first thing he did was throw open every window in the place. He'd been meaning to get the air conditioner looked at since June, but by the time he'd finally called around, every HVAC guy in town was booked solid until September. Told himself he'd survive. He popped the tab on the can from the fridge and told himself, just one, just to celebrate a little peace and quiet. A few days slipped by, and Nick found he liked this. No one asking, no one watching, no one to explain himself to. It reminded him of being 22 again. Bars that stayed open past last call, nights that blurred into mornings. A version of himself he hadn't let out in years. He tried very hard not to think about the rest of it, the parts of being 22 he'd spent the years since trying to bury. 43 years old, married more than a decade, and he'd still managed, somewhere in there, to do something he couldn't forgive himself for, let alone tell Sarah about. There'd been a fight, a bad one, and a bar, and a woman named Jess. It happened almost 2 years back, after one of the worst fights he and Sarah ever had, the kind that starts about something small and ends with someone slamming a door. He'd stormed out, ended up at a bar downtown he'd never once set foot in before, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox nobody used anymore. That's where he met her. She was younger, maybe late 20s, funny in that sharp way that made 2 drinks feel like 4. The rest of that night was the usual blur. One round became several, and by the time anyone was counting had stopped mattering. He woke up the next morning in an apartment on the other side of the city, in a bed that wasn't his, with a headache that felt like punishment arriving early. When it hit him what he'd done, he got dressed in about 90 seconds flat, muttered something about being late, and left without really looking at her. He spent the better part of a month making it up to Sarah for the fight. Never once mentioned the rest of it. Some nights he'd catch her looking at him a certain way, and wonder if she already knew, if she'd always known, and just hadn't said anything. Weeks passed. Then Jess called, said she was pregnant, said she needed money for the clinic. Nothing more specific than that. They met one last time in a parking lot he'd picked because it had cameras, like that mattered. He didn't say much, handed her an envelope. She told him not to worry, that after this, neither one of them would ever have to see the other again. That should have been the end of it. Instead, he spent the better part of a year with his stomach in knots every time the buzzer went off downstairs, sure it would be her, standing in the lobby with a baby in her arms, ready to blow his whole life apart in front of the neighbors. He barely slept for months, jumped every time the phone rang. Eventually, the fear wore itself down to something duller, something he could live around instead of live inside. Life kept moving. He stopped counting the days since it happened. Now, if you'd asked him, he probably couldn't have told you how long it had really been. Nick had genuinely lost track of how many days he'd been on his own now. Work had become something he showed up to so he wouldn't get fired, nothing more than that. He wasn't much of an employee anymore. Everyone at the warehouse office had started noticing. The kind of noticing people don't say out loud, but you can feel anyway. Every night, a few beers turned into more than a few. Every morning, a hangover that took longer and longer to shake. And in between, there was really only one thought that mattered. How fast could he make the headache go away? He and Sarah still called here and there, but he never once told her he was drinking like this. Didn't seem like the kind of thing you brought up over a 5-minute call with your kid yelling something in the background. One morning, about a week after they'd left, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. Staring back at him was a gray, worn-down version of a face he used to recognize. Puffy eyes, color gone out of it entirely. Right there, he decided, enough. The first day sober was rough. He could barely get himself out of bed. His hand shook picking up the glass of water he'd set out for exactly this reason the night before. He drank it down in one go. Didn't help much. Still had to go to work. There was a backlog waiting for him, and he'd promised himself flat out that today he wasn't touching a drop. Guess a guy's got to start somewhere before the wheels come off completely, he muttered to himself, finishing a smoke out on the balcony. His second one already, and it wasn't even 9. Something twisted, sharp and wrong, right in the center of his chest. A jolt of pain went through his whole body. A few seconds later, it passed, and he came back to himself, gasping. Heart attack, the thought flashed through his head before he could stop it. The feeling faded fast, but the dread that came with it didn't go anywhere. Slowly, one hand on the wall the whole way, Nick made it to the bathroom. The second he stepped over the threshold, the room tilted sideways in front of his eyes. The only thing he managed was to fold himself over the toilet. He threw up harder than he ever had in his life. His stomach was already empty, so it was just water coming back up, again and again. 20 minutes that felt like a small eternity later, it finally let him go. He sank down onto the cold tile, breathing hard. Slightly better now. Bracing himself against the vanity, he looked up into the mirror one more time. He looked marginally less awful than the night before, when he'd come home drunk and washed up in a hurry. He cleaned himself up as best he could and rushed off to work. He barely made it through what felt like the longest shift of his life, then dragged himself home. The route home went right past a Circle K he'd been stopping at nearly every night for weeks now. Used to be open all night, that store. Not anymore, apparently. With everything he had left, Nick forced himself to walk past it without going in. The city had been stuck in an unbearable heat wave for almost 3 weeks straight now, the kind that seemed to exist purely to remind you how good a cold beer would feel. He made it past the store and into his building. Spotting a neighbor coming up behind him with a stroller, he ducked into the elevator that had just opened and jabbed the button for his floor before the doors could catch her. He'd never liked the neighbors much, and other people's kids even less. The doors slid shut, and he let out a breath. A second later, he heard a baby start crying. The sound seemed to bounce off the metal walls of the shaft
and land straight in the middle of his already splitting head. Somewhere around the 4th floor, the crying just stopped. Too suddenly. Too completely. Like the baby hadn't stayed in the stroller at all. Like it had crawled out into the shaft itself and was climbing up after the elevator, still screaming the whole way. People shouldn't have kids if they can't stand listening to this, he thought, irritated.
For a second, he actually pictured it. Some infant clawing its way up a dark shaft after him, never once stopping that awful crying. And something about the image made him smile. A nervous, wrong kind of smile. The elevator finally stopped and let him out on the 12th floor. Shutting the apartment door behind him, he exhaled again. Another day, done. Guess I'll make something easy tonight, he thought, even if it's just craft dinner again. Then get some sleep, actually sleep for once, without a drop of alcohol in him. Deep and easy, the way he used to. He was filling a pot with water when he suddenly went completely still. Some strange, half-forgotten feeling had grabbed hold of him out of nowhere. He froze, listening hard to whatever was happening inside his own body. Something in his chest was beating like a small trapped bird, throwing itself against the walls, desperate to get out. His legs went numb. His breath came in short, ragged pulls. A low ringing filled his skull. All he could do was stand there and listen to himself. And that's when it hit him. He knew exactly what this feeling was. It had chased him before, a long time ago, back when things were rawer. He'd just gone so numb over the years that he'd forgotten it existed at all. It was dread. Vague and sticky and shapeless. It moved through him slowly from the inside out, and it did not let go. The water spilling over the rim of the pot, running down over his hands, was the only thing that snapped him out of it. He set the pot down hard on the counter and dropped into a chair, but sitting still didn't help. The dread kept climbing. He shot up and nearly ran out onto the balcony, threw the door open, sat right down on the threshold, pulling in the warm evening air in greedy gulps. It didn't help. He went back to the kitchen, filled a glass with cold water, drank the whole thing in one go. Then he went to the bathroom and splashed his face with ice water a few times. That helped, a little. On his way out, something moved at the edge of his vision. He spun around, catching only a dark shape sliding slowly, almost gently, down the outside of the window. No, he'd just imagined that. He was already covered in a cold sweat. Had to have imagined it. He crossed to the window, threw it open, actually leaned out over the sill. Down at the little playground below, kids were doing what kids do. People were coming home from work. Someone was walking a dog. Nothing out of the ordinary. Everything completely normal. Trying to pull himself all the way back together, Nick went into the bathroom and leaned over the sink. When he lifted his head, there, right at the edge of the mirror, right where his peripheral vision met its limit, he thought he caught a young woman holding some kind of bundle in her arms. He flinched so hard he nearly went down and spun around. Nothing behind him but the shower curtain, half open, swaying slightly. His heart was slamming against his ribs. Barely holding the panic down, he half walked, half ran to the bedroom and dropped onto the bed. He didn't want dinner anymore. Just calm down, he kept telling himself. You're just wiped out. You imagined it. Get some sleep and it'll pass. And, yeah, probably shouldn't have spent this many years pickling your brain in alcohol either. Still fully dressed, he shrugged out of his clothes, dropped them on the floor, got as comfortable as he could,
and shut his eyes. He woke up what felt like maybe 5 minutes later. The clock said almost an hour had passed. He tried to remember what had actually pulled him out of sleep. It felt like someone had leaned in right next to his ear and said his name, low, in a voice that made his skin crawl. The sheets were soaked through with sweat. His whole body wouldn't stop shaking.
Once he'd gotten the worst of the tremor under control, Nick made his way to the kitchen, swaying slightly, opened the medicine cabinet, and swallowed down 2 sleeping pills without a second thought. He usually hated taking anything like that, but Sarah dealt with insomnia now and then, so there was always a bottle in the house. Tonight, he was glad for it. He washed the pills down, dealt with the pot still sitting cold on the stove, and went back to bed. Sleep still wouldn't come. Every time he shut his eyes, blurry, half-formed shapes started forming behind his eyelids. At some point, his mind just switched off for a few minutes, and in that gap, he dreamed. It felt more real than most things that happened to him while he was actually awake. In the middle of his bedroom stood a young woman, silent, holding a bundle in her arms. Her face stayed lost in shadow, but he could feel, not see, that she was looking directly at him, and had been the whole time. Then the bundle in her arms started to move. Something slick, alive, began working its way out of it, a long, formless length of something that looked more like flesh than fabric, and it kept getting longer with every second that passed. Nick couldn't move a muscle. His whole body had turned to stone, and all he could do was watch as the thing crept closer, inch by inch, toward the foot of the bed. It was nearly at his feet when a long, thin wail broke out of the bundle, the unmistakable cry of a newborn. Nick jerked awake so violently he fell straight off the bed and hit the floor. For a second there was only ringing silence. Then, from somewhere down the hall, unbearably faint, he heard a baby crying. He scrambled up onto his feet. The room was empty, quiet. Somewhere in the next apartment over, very faintly, a kid was crying, that was all. Still, cold sweat had already soaked straight through his shirt. The apartment felt suffocating, the air thick and impossible to pull into his lungs. Cursing himself for being too cheap to get the AC fixed properly, he threw every window back open and decided a cold shower was the only thing left to try. Moving through the apartment toward the bathroom, he kept glancing back over his shoulder, half expecting to catch someone standing there who had no business being in his home. The image from the dream wouldn't leave him alone. Stepping into the shower and turning the water on cold finally took some of the edge off. Standing under the freezing spray, he tried and failed to get his thoughts to line back up straight. They kept sliding sideways, and then one thought snagged on something and held. He thought about that old debt he'd never really paid off. Jess. That had been her name, right? He was almost sure. And the thought came to him in a voice that didn't quite feel like his own. You never called her back. Not once, did you? What if there really was a kid out there somewhere? No, what kid? He pushed back, mentally. Just some stupid drunk mistake, that's all it ever was. He barely even remembered what she looked like. It happens. People make mistakes. And only then did it register that he was standing in his own shower, arguing with himself out loud. That realization scared him worse than anything else so far that night. Okay, that's it. No more drinking. Full stop. One more bender like that, and he'd be headed straight for the DTS, he thought, half laughing at himself in a way that had no humor in it at all.
He stayed under the water a few minutes longer, and it did help settle him down, some. But the heavy feeling in his chest never fully went away. In its place came a bone-deep exhaustion that he could feel settling into every part of him. He dried off, walked back to the bedroom, and the moment his head hit the pillow, sleep took him instantly, like someone had thrown a switch.
His second straight night with barely any real rest had pushed his body somewhere past simple tiredness, and by now Nick was shaking from sheer exhaustion. He tried to fall back asleep, but it kept coming in broken pieces, shot through with short, ugly nightmares that felt far too real. He'd jolt awake after each one, drenched in cold sweat. The dread just kept tightening around his chest. Lying there on a mattress gone damp with sweat, he rolled from one side to the other without end. Every so often he checked the clock and saw it had long since slid past midnight. Sleep never came. And then something happened that made absolutely no sense. Somewhere in the apartment, an old landline phone started ringing. He'd been meaning to have that line disconnected for years now. Some ancient contract from whoever had the unit before them, still hooked up, still technically active, never worth the hassle of canceling. Nick sat straight up in bed. "What the hell?" he muttered, not fully processing yet where the sound was even coming from. That old landline. The one he'd been meaning to cancel for months and just never got around to. Why would it even be ringing? He pulled on a pair of slippers and walked the dark hallway toward it. Moonlight poured in cold and pale through every window, and the whole apartment had gone unnervingly still. He picked up the receiver. "Hello?" A few seconds of pure silence. Then a woman's voice came through, distant, cold, like it was traveling to him through water. "Why did you never call me back?" Nick's brow pulled tight. "Who is this?" I waited a long time." "Who are you?" The line clicked dead. "Some kind of prank," he muttered, and yanked the cord clean out of the wall jack. Heading back toward the bedroom, he glanced automatically into his daughter's room. Standing dead center in a stripe of moonlight was a tall, dark shape, perfectly still. He took one more step forward, and only then did what he was looking at fully land. His heart nearly stopped in his chest, and he threw himself back against the wall, not moving, barely breathing. Who the hell is in my apartment? Gathering everything he had left, he forced himself to turn on the light. Empty. Nobody there. Just his daughter's toys, sitting exactly where they always sat. Nick let out a shaky, humorless laugh at himself. Okay, officially losing it. And right at that exact moment, the phone started ringing again. He froze solid. The cord was still lying there on the floor, unplugged. The phone had no business ringing, and it was ringing anyway. Barely able to make his legs cooperate, he plugged the cord back in and picked up. "Hello? Who is this now? You're not hiding from me anymore." That same voice. And now Nick understood exactly why it had sounded so familiar. Jess. It hit him like a physical blow. That was her name. That was definitely her. No, it's not her. It can't be her. The one he'd told himself for years he was never going to think about again. "I've been gone a long time," she said quietly. "But I'm not alone." Nick's knees buckled under him. We're coming to see you. Wait for us." At the end of it, she laughed, very softly. Underneath that laugh, a baby started to cry, and the two sounds slowly bled together,
Nick stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, unable to even loosen his grip on the receiver. Then, all at once, everything went dead silent. The phone slid out of his hand on its own and hit the floor. He bolted for the bedroom, slammed the door, slid down it until he was sitting on the floor. His head was spinning. How does she have this number? How is any of this possible? She's been... A few minutes passed. Then something heavy thudded down in the kitchen. Then again, and again. Not footsteps, exactly. More like something dragging its own weight forward, slow and impossibly heavy. A smell crept into the room. Wet rot, spoiled meat, sulfur. Something was making its way, slowly, toward the bedroom door. "Nick," a whisper came, right through the wood. "Stop hiding. I'll find you no matter what." Panic swallowed him whole. He looked around the room. Under the bed? No, the closet. Better. He threw himself inside, pulled the doors almost shut, left just the thinnest crack to see through. The bedroom door creaked open on its own. Something stepped into the room. From a distance it might have passed for the young woman from before, barely. Gray skin, unnaturally smooth. A swollen, bloated body. Arms too long, dragging along the floor as it moved. Every step landed with a wet, sickening crunch. "Nick? Where are you?" A pause. "I can feel you." The thing arched backwards with a horrible, wet crack, like its spine had snapped in half and kept going. Fine cracks spread across its stomach and shoulders, and something thick and black started seeping slowly out of them. It bent down and looked under the bed. Nick held his breath and didn't move. Get out now, while it's not looking. He tried to shift his weight carefully, and his foot caught something. A soft, quiet knock against the closet door. That was all it took. The thing's head snapped around. "There you are." Its voice came out almost cheerful now. It started moving straight for the closet. Nick shoved out through the doors and dropped low, scrambling on his hands and knees toward the bedroom door. Behind him he could hear the heavy, wet shuffle closing in. He grabbed the handle and froze. The hallway wasn't there anymore. Past the door was nothing but a black, bottomless drop. He turned slowly. The thing was already right behind him, close enough to touch. Its mouth stretched into a smile no human face was built to make. It reached both arms out toward him. Nick stepped back. His foot found nothing but air, and he went down. No scream, no impact. Nothing. Just the rectangle of moonlit hallway shrinking above him, getting smaller and smaller, until it winked out completely. Only darkness left all around. Then, a sudden hard jolt. Nick's breath caught sharply in his throat. He was lying on the floor of his own hallway, like none of it had happened at all. He didn't stop to think, grabbed his keys off the hook, bolted out of the apartment, locked the door behind him from the outside, and immediately heard something on the other side, scraping slowly against the wood. Faint through the door came the sound of a lullaby. Mick took the stairs, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, lungs already burning, refusing to look back. Somewhere below, the elevator groaned into motion. He hit the next landing just as it dinged, right beside him, and the door slid open. Inside stood something enormous, shaped in the worst possible way, like a giant human fetus. If a human fetus could grow arms and legs, stretched far too long for any body.
Slick, ropey growths uncoiled from behind it, filling the small space. A pair of cloudy white eyes fixed straight on him. And then, all together, 1,000 small voices whispered as one. "Dad." Long limbs shot out and wrapped around him. The elevator doors slid shut. When the paramedics carried a man's body out of the building lobby, the attending doctor just let out a long breath. "Heart just gave out on him," he said, mostly to himself. They loaded him into the ambulance without another word. A few days later, Sarah came home with their daughter. The apartment had been turned completely upside down, furniture knocked over, drawers pulled out, the closet emptied onto the floor, the bedsheets torn half off the mattress. A strange, dark, greasy stain ran from the bedroom all the way to the kitchen and stopped right at the open window. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, saying nothing. Their daughter was already asleep down the hall. Outside, the last of the light finally drained out of the sky. The apartment settled into a heavy, complete silence. And then, out in the hallway, the landline started to ring. The same phone, cord still lying disconnected on the floor, exactly where it had been left.